most of my patients with complex chronic illness that come to me with symptoms that are unexplainable, fatigue, joint pain, gastrointestinal issues, brain fog, it's very, very often that they do have a mold issue in their home. Yes, they're going to also have typically tick bites and a high viral load and high parasites and everything, but it's very, very often that mold sets the stage for everything else in the system to flare.
Right. Environmentally, mold is kind of our surrogate. When you think about all things water damage, there's certainly other things that can happen, right? We can get bacteria growth, we can have chemicals off-gassing from building materials, but a lot of times mold, if it's not the direct contaminant, is the surrogate for other things, because people don't want to spend $50,000 testing for everything under the sun in their home.
Right.
It's a great way to start for sure.
Right. So let's talk about beyond doing an ERMI. This is where you would come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the event that somebody reaches out to us, whether they've done their own initial sampling or they haven't, a lot of times we're doing kind of what you're doing to start. We're doing a client intake. We're trying to learn from them. Why are we here in the first place?
Right.
You don't just show up. A good IEP, again, indoor environmental professional, is not just going to show up blindly or tell you over the phone how much it's going to cost. That would imply that they have the ability to detect what is the issue. And at that point, you might be asking, well, do we even need a sample if you're that good? A good IEP is going to listen to why they're there. You're there because probably there's a health complaint, and you probably, as a client or a patient, have maybe a couple few areas where maybe there's been some water events, damp crawl space, a toilet that overflowed a couple of years ago, and you're trying to figure out whether or not these could be areas or sources that could affect the normal fungal ecology. That's a term for everybody. Our goal is normal fungal ecology. That's what we're looking for. We're not looking for mold-free because we don't live on a bubble in Mars. We live on planet Earth. And even looking at your background, you have plenty of sources behind you outside where there's going to be molds and bacteria. This is your normal fungal ecology that's getting into that building. So what do we do after we kind of get an idea of an assessment of what's the scope? Here are the areas of concern. A good IEP is still going to walk the whole house. We're going to put some special focus on the areas you, the client, have mentioned. But a good pair of eyeballs and a flashlight are probably the most powerful tools, that and knowledge and experience of what to look for. Signs of water staining, swelling or separation of the baseboard next to the exterior walls, underneath your vanities or cabinets, and kitchen sinks and water heaters. All of these, you're seeing a theme of maybe where moisture can get into, that sort of thing. And trying to provide a non-numerical value to these areas. Is this an obvious area that should be remediated? Or is it more of a question? How many of you listening have had a case where, well, yeah, we got water staining under the kitchen sink cabinet, but we don't want to spend $6,000 or more to replace that because of an assumption? So the inspector will then sit down with you and say, well, what are the remaining balance of our questions that we can't answer visually? We know that's an area over there that needs to be remediated. It's actual growth on your actual cabinet. This isn't more of an obvious issue, but what if it's not obvious? What if it's just staining, or it's this whole debate about, well, do we really need to fix the crawl space? I've heard that can be really expensive. That's where sampling comes in. And we can dive deeper into that depending on where you want to go. But a good inspector will sit down with you and talk about a host of different types of samples, typically around mold or bacteria, but all for answering different types of questions. If you're doing a dust sample in a home, for example, we talked about this ERMI before, that will be good for giving you average exposures, kind of the ballpark discussion you mentioned earlier, or maybe even zoning the house down. Like, oh, did you notice that we did 2 or 3 in the home and we noticed the master was higher? That's weird. What's going on in the master that's not going on in the other parts of the house? It's not going to tell you where the mold's coming from. So a good inspector will have the ability to inspect, and here's a new term, interstitial cavities, wall cavities, the cavity underneath a kitchen sink or a vanity, that little, if you have a bottom shelf, there's a cavity underneath there, up in the attic, down in the crawl space. These are areas that you don't get to see without usually opening up or being destructive. So what are those tools and techniques that a good inspector can have? Well, doing things like cavity sampling, where they literally sample the air from these cavities. It's minimally destructive. It's about a little 3/8 inch of a hole with a special tube that goes into this cavity space and takes a sample. Or if they don't have that, they can do a thing called mycometer. It's a well-known test that it's a swab sample looking for fungal enzymes. Is it higher right here? Oh my gosh, we did a swab sample and there's a mold source we found here. There's a number of techniques, but you want to know that your good IEP has the ability to locate the source, because if all they do is tell you you have a problem in the home based off of your dust sample that you took earlier, that's not going to really help you know where you need to remediate, what you need to focus on. And finally, a good IEP, this is the 30,000-foot perspective, believe it or not, is going to be able to give you a report with findings and recommendations. Now, what do I mean? Okay, so findings are probably self-explanatory. We saw this visually, or historically, you've given us this information. Here's some sample data. Here's what we found. But what about the interpretation of it? Believe it or not, there are companies out there that will not interpret the data for you. In fact, they'll leave it to the lab to interpret. And I always found that silly, because usually the person best able to interpret these samples is the person that's been out there with you, involved, understanding the unique part of your environment that could help explain whether or not this particular sample is elevated or not, in fact. Because keep in mind, these same mold species that could be growing in your home are right behind Nafisa's window behind her, or other locations in your outside that could affect what is normal for you. And that leads me to the recommendations. What are they recommending? If I tell you you have a problem in your house, if I say, yep, your air samples or dust samples indicate contamination exists, and I think it's coming from the crawl space, what do I do about it? Is it good luck? So a good IEP is going to be able to write protocol for you and literally say you need to contact this type of company and in this specific order, and there might be 5 to 10 steps, basically give you a game plan, an action plan, so that when you get done spending all that money to have an inspector come out to do a thorough inspection of the home, you have what it takes to do the next step. Maybe if you do need remediation, you need to contact a remediation company. You do need to contact a crawl space company. You shouldn't have to expect that you need to figure that out on your own. A good IEP in this climate with these types of patients that we're working with should help provide that information for you, because it's going to be overwhelming when you realize that you might have 2 or 3 problems, but you don't know who to call next.